Welcome back to Aether Hour, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalygin and a special guest who I'm sure needs no introduction to this audience. We are, of course, joined by Jay Dyer. He will say hello in 1 second, but we're going to be discussing, obviously, a very relevant, very in the news topic these days, that is the JFK assassination and sort of the adjacent conspiracy that has been unfolding since, really the early 20th century, almost at the earliest. Of course, we can get back with some of these, intelligence, mafia connections, of course, which we're going to get into. But of course, the JFK assassination, sort of the, 9/11 of the boomer generation, the 20th century, at the beginning of earlier years of their lives. And it really set the stage for what we're witnessing right now, which of course we consider the ongoing Third World War, with everything going on in the Middle East and, Israeli capture of American institutions, as well as, of course, the deep state and its reign over everybody's lives here in America. So we're going to be getting into all of that. It's going to be a fantastic show. I couldn't think of anyone else to have on besides Jay for this. So it's going to be a wonderful talk. And we thank you all for tuning in, of course. Dmitry, how are you doing?
Doing amazing, Conrad. I'm very excited to be here, of course, speaking to Jay once again. So it'll be an awesome episode. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, I think this is a great meeting of the minds, of course, as the World War Now audience will appreciate. But Jay, I want to ask how you're doing. And, obviously there's been a lot of things going on. I've seen a lot of your content doing pretty well in the midst of the JFK files drop and, some of these other things that are, of course, in your wheelhouse. So I'm glad to see you getting some of the recognition you deserve. Welcome to the show once again.
Yeah, man. Thank you. Glad to be here. This is one of the things that I call kind of the classic boomer conspiracy, because really the limits of what boomers were able to even possibly question would be like UFOs and JFK. So it's not my focus, but I have looked into the JFK stuff over the years. I've read a few books on it, and I'm sure we'll get into those texts today. But more recently, I've actually been diving deeper into the history of the Mossad and their operations and their whistleblowers, Ostrovsky's books, that kind of stuff. I just did a 3-hour live stream on Israeli Mossad versus Syria, Lebanon, Iran, surrounding regions there, or surrounding nation states there, and how that game is played. So I'm pretty up to date on a lot of this stuff. But again, I just want to stress that when it comes to the JFK stuff, I'm not an expert in that subject matter. There's other things I know way more about, but I can speak to it with some degree of knowledge.
No, and I think the stuff that you know about is sort of why we're even interested in the JFK assassination, more of as a segue into discussing like those things you talked about, of course, the Mossad, which of course has, outsized control over the US government, organized crime, and how it interplays with different governments and intelligence agencies around the world, as if there really was just large-scale organized criminal syndicates operating in these countries with completely under the nose of the government, which apparently boomers were willing to believe for a whole generation.
Right. Yeah,
So
exactly.
I think a lot of these, people are pretty hip to a lot of this stuff now. But with these, again, everyone's kind of said this. There wasn't necessarily a smoking gun, you could say, obviously, in these latest file drops. I know that there are still a few things that need to be released and whatnot. But I guess just to dive right into, the subject matter at hand, the reason people clicked on the video is they want to know who killed JFK, right? And I think if you look through the files, if you've read, kind of the mainstream approved boomer conspiracy literature and then cross-referenced it with, the actual revelations that we've gotten recently, it seems that what has unfolded is there was, again, I'm simplifying here and I'd love for you to unpack this. It seemed that there was effectively a Zionist, Israeli, Mossad-aligned faction within the Central Intelligence Agency, led by James Angleton, head of counterintelligence, pretty much the shadow king of the CIA for most of the central 20th century, and that they, in collaboration with organized crime, specifically the Jewish Mafia in Dallas and Hollywood and other places, they collaborated with them, because they also sort of had a sort of tangential beef and, political business relations with the Kennedy family. That was then utilized to assassinate JFK, who was in the midst of effectively exposing, dismantling, and preventing the Israeli nuclear weapons program from coming to fruition. So with that as a sort of broad roadmap, tell me what's correct about that analysis. What rabbit holes prove that this was what was really going on? And what do these documents recently say about this?
Yeah, I think there's a confluence of interests. That's kind of what I've thought for a good while now. And one thing that got me back into the JFK sphere in the last few years was actually just going down the rabbit hole of studying organized crime in the U.S. and its role with, longtime connections to the deep state. So you can go back to, the OSS making alignments with the Sicilian Mafia prior to and at the time of World War II to get intelligence on the Axis powers, particularly Mussolini and what was going on in Italy. And so that alliance was there for a long time. Likewise, you had separate alliances in the US between the intelligence apparatus and our internal organized crime structure. And there's some debate about this. I don't really have a set answer as to whether the Jewish mafia structured the Italian mafia. I think sometimes you talk about that, and Italian mafia people will get kind of angry about that. And they'll be like, no, like we structured it and then they borrowed our model. Okay, well, whoever borrowed whose model, I don't really care either way. But there was definitely an alliance at some point between Lucky Luciano, who worked with Meyer Lansky. And Meyer Lansky, of course, is part of the Sidney Korshak structure, which is, of course, Jewish mafia. So these interests will align for certain things. And I don't think we have to necessarily say that it was all one thing. So, and I'm not saying that to like, oh, here he goes, he's running defense for Israel. I actually just think that there was a perfect confluence of people who would have had the motive to get rid of the JFK administration. And that does not mean that I'm some, huge fan of sort of JFK stuff. And I think his policies are pretty lame in the sense of like just kind of low tier, democracy is the hope for the world, democratic capitalism. He was probably seen as too soft on the Soviets. So that could have been one motivation for the power structure in America that was more neoconservative or the sort of the dullest faction of sort of stuff. They would have wanted a heavier-handed approach to the Cold War, is what I'm trying to say. So he would have made people mad in that regard. There's these other allegations I'm sure everybody knows that, he wanted to, fix the money system. He wanted to do this and that. And of course, he opposed Dimona, which is Israel's nuclear program. And so all of these things, I think, went into, he wanted to bust up, the CIA into a million pieces or whatever. So all of this, as well as, this is a key thing that people forget, when the Kennedys, both RFK and JFK, were helped by the mafia to get into power, the mob went to the unions and helped them get elected. And this is very well known. It's not even really a conspiracy. It's pretty much admitted, particularly in regard to like Chicago stuff and the Chicago Mafia, which was run by Sam Giancana, Momo. And we also know that those connections run pretty deep because Momo was banging Marilyn Monroe at the same time as JFK. So they're swapping, ladies as well as having these sort of understandings that, well, when you get into power, you're going to help, what we want. You're going to do some of what we want. Well, Bobby Jr. did not keep to that. He went after the mafia, and this angered the mafia. And there's a lot of evidence for this. In fact, the FBI had tapes that were inadmissible because they were illegally recording at the time. But they have, Carlos Marcello, who was the chief mobster out of New Orleans, basically saying that we finally got him, after he'd been shot. So they were championing these assassinations of the Kennedys, which is pretty damning. But again, it's a confluence of interests because you understand that doesn't mean that, it wasn't the CIA or Israel didn't have a role. It was the mafia. These things all worked together and have for a long time, again, going back to the OSS and World War II. So these networks are established, these connections are established. And one thing, for example, the CIA might do or other groups, if you wanted to get rid of somebody, using organized crime is an easy way to do that because you just sort of contract out the hit and nobody traces it back to the CIA. So, for example, the CIA was trying to do this. It's pretty well known with Santos Trafficante, who was the mafia chief down in like Miami. They actually gave Trafficante like a giant briefcase full of like $200,000 if he could get rid of certain people. This is well known. This is all part of Bobby Kennedy Jr. had a bunch of hearings about all this, I think in the late 70s. And nothing really came of it, except that they found all of these FBI files that are just inadmissible and recordings that pretty much prove, the mafia had a central role. And then again, adjacent to that, what we have in the documents is a lot of suspicions that writers had suspected were the case, like Michael Collins Piper in his book about Israel and JFK, as well as even Roger Stone more recently in his assessments of the JFK event is they really had this confluence of interest of CIA, organized crime, the group of Cubans in Chicago who were backed and working with the Jewish Mafia and Israeli operatives. And that now we know from the declassified files, particularly in regard to Angleton, I think those are the most relevant because he had a back channel that was set up with both the FBI and the Mossad to pass secrets and information to them. That's probably the most relevant and the most significant in the release. And you're absolutely right. Like Angleton was one of these key, Cold War figures who was an Israeliophile. They created when he passed away, they created a garden to honor him in Israel. So, so I think that's what's going on is a confluence of interest. And we know that this was a big deal because if you know about later on, Mordecai Vanunu, he's the one that leaked the Israeli nuclear program, which was still at the time considered speculative and not real and not true. Then when it was leaked, Mossad entrapped him with some ugly woman. Do you guys know about Vanunu?
No, not too many details.
Okay, well, this is how we know that Israel has a nuclear program. And this was like in the early 80s. So he's he's not Israeli, he's actually an Episcopalian. And he somehow knew he was working, I guess, in the government, but he knew about Israel's nuclear program. And so he leaked that. And that's how it became known that they had it, which was still, I guess, at that time considered to be secret information. But Mossad then entrapped him and kind of ruined his life with some ugly woman that he slept with. So this is a pretty famous story. It's like, this is not conspiracy theorizing. This is all public, well-known information. But anyway, I'm rambling, but you get the idea. So basically, I think it's a confluence of interest that you've got, Israeli interests, mafia interests. I forgot to mention that one of the reasons that Carlos Marcello in particular was really mad was that they flew him to, I said it wrong the other day on my podcast, it wasn't Guam. They flew him down to Central Latin South America, some Honduras, middle of nowhere, and just dropped him off. And he got back into the U.S., the Kennedys. He got back into the U.S. through one of his drug shrimp boats that he ran. And when he got back, he vowed that, the Kennedys are done for. So again, I'm not saying that means Carlos Marcello was behind everything. But again, this confluence of interests that one of the documents points to a figure who was admitted in the documents to be a former Pentagon sort of ghost operative who said, they're going to kill Kennedy. I know they're planning this. This is real, blah, 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 blah. I'm not talking about the later Bulgarian consulate embassy thing. I'm talking about the earlier guy who claimed that he had heard about this rogue faction within the CIA, which is sort of the Colonel Fletcher Prouty secret team sort of network. And this is kind of like you said, like people under Angleton or others that would have been running the Black Ops. And of course, Angleton plays a key role in Gladio as well. So it's not the CIA is like a giant organization doing it. It's sort of like probably LBJ and his Mafia connections and his Israel connections probably went to Angleton, E. Howard Hunt, other people, and said, we got to do something about this. And there were probably, backroom cigar meetings with different people. And this was probably planned out with these secret team Black Ops type people.
No, absolutely. And I think the geopolitical angle is one of the most underappreciated, especially by the boomers who I think pay a bit too much attention to major events such as the Bay of Pigs, which again these are all huge events in terms of the scope of what was happening in the 60s. Post-World War II was sort of the biggest breakthrough since the Korean War, essentially. And of course, you had the incredible Vietnam War taking place, which a lot of boomers are still sort of traumatized by and can't really look outside of. They sort of have these horse blinders on, and it's like a massive distraction for them. But what they don't realize, of course, is that in the Middle East, you had, of course, the Arab-Israeli conflict essentially brewing, like this huge maelstrom, which again is still ongoing today. And it's really a major issue even during the Trump presidency. So this is how the continuity that the JFK times have to today. And what's interesting again, Jay, is you mentioned that organized crime had such a huge link to the politics of America, which is literally identical to what was happening across the sea, of course, in the USSR. It's almost like you have this spectrum of essentially the Bolsheviks, the communists were professional criminals, most of them. Even people like Nikita Khrushchev and Leonid Brezhnev, they were uplifted and sort of dragged into the higher elite tiers of the Communist Party by somebody like Lazar Kaganovich. And the Kaganovich family was just famous for being these hardcore, essentially political terrorists, working for Stalin. And just like the Kennedy family was uplifted by the mafia and the mob, it seems like regardless of which, whether or not you're a capitalist or a communist, both sides of the spectrum were again supported by these two very different groups of organized crime. But in relation to the geopolitical tension around Israel and the Arab states, Kennedy, it seems, was very much in favor of non-nuclear proliferation. You mentioned that. Was there any connection to the USSR, or are these links more or less artificial? Is it like a red herring in relation to what was happening between the Arab states and Israel? Because we do know, of course, Lee Harvey Oswald, he could speak Russian fluently, for example. He kept traveling over there. How connected is the other Russians to this particular assassination? Or is this more or less one of these big distractions that's essentially very highlighted in the media, very highlighted in the movies and the books, but in reality, it doesn't weigh anything?
Yeah, I think that, the documents that we've seen did point to that angle. I think that whatever was going on with Oswald, he definitely was in some degree. I kind of think of Oswald, to me, he's kind of like a Tim McVeigh, like maybe a sheep dip kind of dude who is probably at some level working with the CIA. And then he becomes sort of this perfect patsy. So they needed him to have these, plausible KGB Soviet connections in order to have a credible normie narrative that Oswald was, look here, he's been to the Soviet Union. He's got doesn't he have a Russian girlfriend or something like that? You know what I mean? Like or a wife or something.
I think it was even his wife. Yeah, he married her.
So it's so I think they needed this kind of crafted legend, but I don't believe he was a committed Soviet or a real operative of the Russian. Of the Soviets, I think he was the perfect sort of patsy. And just like with McVeigh, in my opinion, my view, was probably sheep dipped, but they did need to have him sort of, go and do things and establish these kinds of connections. And as you mentioned, the Cuban exile type individuals, that's who was fighting at the Bay of Pigs. And that's also, interestingly, that's sort of the CIA trained Cuban exiles that are fighting in that Bay of Pigs situation. And then that's curiously who we see in the guy's name was like something Vechikari or whatever. The guy that's in Chicago who is one of these Cuban exiles who's claiming that they have the backing of certain Jewish financiers. So that's an interesting connection. And I do think that you're right to point out the possibility of, the way that the power works is that they'll use the good guys and the bad guys if they need to. And intelligence agencies have always had these connections with unsavory characters. It's just part of the nature of the game. In fact, the former head of the Mossad in that Al Jazeera interview that I've been sharing and that we talked about the other night, like he just openly says in the interview, well, yeah, of course we funded Al-Qaeda, al-Nusra in Syria. It's like part of the game, which is interesting because you're not supposed to talk about that. And when I was talking about it, writing about it from 2014 to 2017 with 21st Century Wire, like I got called every name in the book. It's like, well, but we know this is going on. No. So John McCain's over here like pictured with Al-Qaeda dudes. What are you talking about? No, it's not real. It doesn't exist. And then lo and behold, 7 months ago, New York Times puts out the declassified admission of Timber Sycamore. So $1 billion CIA project of, obviously British intelligence, Mossad, CIA, all funding, army, and training al-Nusra, which is Al-Qaeda, to get rid of Assad. So we knew that this was going on. And now you've got the former head of Mossad saying, well, yeah, of course we would. We want to create a destabilizing effect in Syria. We don't want Syria to be stabilized. We want to destabilize. He just admitted it in the interview. So it's pretty crazy. But I guess they figured like all this stuff is just out there now. Who cares? But, it's the same situation with what you're talking about with probably early Bolsheviks utilizing and bringing into their network figures from organized crime. And it was the same with the early Israeli intelligence networks that were set up. Ergen, Stern Gang, those are all essentially organized crime networks. You probably heard in America, about Murder Inc. Well, Murder Inc. was all of the original Jewish assassins who, again, helped structure and tell the Italian families in the U.S. how to set up their sort of assassination. It's an assassination guild, basically, is what Murder Inc. was. And then the Italians just simply copied that structure and model too. So, Yeah, this is just basic sort of power alignments that, if you're a super state or the state, you're going to want to align yourselves with anything that can get the job done. And that includes the unsavory, black network, black markets, that kind of stuff. And then in regard to the Mafia and LBJ, there's another Israel connection because, of course, LBJ, famously said in regard to the Egypt versus Israel situation, I want that, USS Liberty, I want that damn ship sunk, right? Right. In regard to USS Liberty, everybody knows about this now, right? So that was for Israel.
And then he said, what was it like? We will not release any information or say anything that will implicate our ally Israel. When people, asked what happened about it, I think that was what he said as well.
Right. But I mean, that's part of that conflict to ensure that, we would be on the side of Israel because of this, fake false flag event that went wrong, apparently.
Yeah, everyone's red-pilled on the Liberty now. We had, Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson even having the survivors on. And obviously that takes us to just the whole, 1963, this is less than 20 years after, the Nakba, after the beginning of the Zionist project, which of course initiated after the Balfour Declaration at the end of, the World War I. We had the World Wars, we had the Balfour Declaration, and then we had, the fall of the Ottoman Empire. And now eventually we had British mandate in Palestine, where now we have Israel. And I think, the connections aren't just Israel. Like you said, there was the Jewish organized crime element, and we even have a whole Hollywood kind of angle here now in the post-JFK conspiracy world. People are asking like, oh, you're just blaming Jews for everything. You're just attributing like, why does everything have to be involved with Jews? And well, besides the obvious Israeli connection, and then there's the whole Soviet angle, which I'm going to get into in a second, you need to recognize that banking, usury, organized crime, Hollywood, acting, movies, these sorts of things, these are always, peripheral. These are things on the outskirts of society. And if people have been, identifying themselves as being separate from Christian civilization and Christian society for, generations and generations, they're going to be the main people populating, these, what you could call sort of outside of the mainstream of, white Christian civilization. They're going to be the ones occupying, these positions and building these shadow networks, like you just said, creating these sort of models for, I don't want to say seedy, just the most sort of black, covert, secret behavior that any sort of organized group can engage in. And then they're outsourcing that to these other people that find themselves on the outsides of that same society. But I think one of the reasons why the US sort of became the main golem instead of the Soviet Union, because for those that remember, if the people especially listen to episode 20 of Aether Hour, we discussed this a lot with what happened to Father Makarios in the Holy Land, is initially the Soviet Union and the United States supported Israel. The biggest group of Jews that entered Palestine to populate the Zionist state were from Russia, were from the Soviet Union. And of course, we know the Bolsheviks also were heavily Jewish and influenced by that. But by the time Stalin came around, the Jewish element in the Soviet Union had largely been, I don't want to say entirely purged, but had been much more relegated and was no longer as in control. Whereas in the United States, with what we see going on with how much organized crime had been infiltrating, offices like Lyndon Johnson, who everyone thinks is a good old Texas boy just living down the street from me here in Johnson City. But he is, I think he's probably the worst president we've ever had. But he, of course, was involved with all of this stuff. You, of course, had, like you said, Meyer Lansky. And then you have the entire Gladio connection, which everybody, knows about, the Italian mafia and the weapons and everything that were eventually getting smuggled to the Middle East. But that was also being facilitated by the connection between the Jewish mafia and the Italian mafia. Because, of course, we have on record Jewish mobsters admitting that they dedicated months and months of their lives and their operations sort of at a loss almost from their organized crime profits to operate on the behest of Israel, because a lot of these Jewish mobsters did have that Zionist loyalty, which was, really sweeping world Jewry at the time. So I guess my question to you, Jay, is we know that the Soviet Union ultimately ended up siding more with the Arabs against the Israelis. We still see the fallout from that today, with Russia being a close ally of Iran, Syria, these other forces in Iraq and Egypt and whatnot. But as, the situation with JFK unfolded, why did, when the Cold War then went on the way that it did it sort of secure the dialectic for the boomer, I guess, as JFK was kind of the last person that was willing to say, maybe Israel is being perhaps even more of a detriment to world security than the Soviet Union. Once JFK was taken out, the narrative of the Cold War, which you've talked about extensively being a false dialectic, that was fully able to manifest for the boomer generation once you took care of JFK.
Well, if you go to Dealey Plaza, it's interesting because it's a giant propaganda sort of ritual shrine site to democracy and capitalism. And, it's kind of the same with the ideas behind MLK. So they kind of immediately tailored it to be this martyrdom kind of idea that, these are the secular saints of democratic capitalism for the world. So it definitely solidified, by the way, as did, I would argue, other Cold War events, such as Ali Agca's attempted assassination of John Paul II, JFK being assassinated purportedly by a Soviet operative, Oswald. I mean, you keep getting this perfect sort of normie tier, prepackaged, perfectly packaged story that boomers would just eat up. Oh yeah, look at the Soviets. They say they hate us so much. They're going to kill, JFK. They're going to kill and then of course the other side. If it's not going to be a Soviet, it's got to be some kind of a crazy racist, right, that kills MLK. But this just solidifies the narrative. You create martyrs for the cause. You mentioned organized crime again. I haven't forgotten your overall question here about the overall dialectic, but two things. First, I would say, if you look at the way that the CIA trained and helped set up Turkish intelligence, they used the Grey Wolves, which was organized crime in Turkey, and that's who they helped to kind of be the muscle when they set up the nascent MIT, which is Turkish intelligence. And then one of those figures from the Wolves just happens to be studying at a CIA front called Prodeo, run by Felix. I forget that guy's last name. He's a famous Dominican OSS operative and he's one of the earliest ecumenists too. He's like a very famous Dominican, Felix something. And he sets up this network of language training places for the Vatican and the CIA, which is obviously a cover. It's OSS at this time. And oddly enough, Ali Agca goes and studies under this guy, which is, to me, is very, okay, so he's supposed to be a Turkish, KGB operative because he's studying under these famous OSS operatives. It just doesn't really work. But he's out of the world of organized crime and hits, and then he becomes one of the key figures to end the Cold War because of the supposed attempted assassination and martyrdom of John Paul II. And people forget how important that image was because they were able to immediately say, he's basically another Oswald, right? So he's another Soviet person, KGB person. That's the narrative that the CIA ran with right away. And I've read the pro-CIA and the anti-CIA versions of this. So I know both sides of it. You can read John Kaler's book about KGB and spies in the Vatican, who's pro-CIA. And then there's Genzer's book on Gladio and Paul Williams' book on Gladio, which are both critiques. And what you get is this narrative that really only helps the CIA in the West. It doesn't help the Soviets to be like assassinating these figures like John Paul II or, JFK. It just, again, it creates the martyrdom or almost martyrdom civic sainthood for the figures who become symbolic images of the so-called democratic free West, which, as we know, is not authentic, right? Even the Roman Catholic Church is not really historically known for democratic capitalism. And yet, after Vatican II, we see a pretty heavy shift to where a church that previously taught the necessity of a Christian state and the necessity of the Catholic religion, the Roman Catholic religion, suddenly shifts and becomes the religion of John Courtney Murray, Jesuit, freedom of conscience, freedom of worship, freedom of religion nonsense. Why is that? Well, it's because there's a gigantic 800-page book by David Wimhoff about how the CIA, through the declassified doctrinal warfare program of 2013, declassified in 2013, it was during the Cold War, how they co-opted and utilized all these Jesuits and other theologians, the Periti of Vatican II, to push Americanist and pro-Jewish and pro-Muslim ideas at Vatican II. So now that we know this, it's kind of absurd, really, for Roman Catholics to kind of try to defend all this stuff or defend Vatican II or defend John Paul II like he's this great sort of saint martyr figure, proto-martyr or almost martyr, whatever they think about him. Like, I still see normie Roman Catholic videos like Brian Holsworth, like, John Paul II ended the Cold War. He's a Cold War hero. And it's like, dude, he ended the Cold War by like meeting with William Casey and Kissinger all the time and like being told what to do. Like all of the solidarity, that was a giant CIA operation, right? In Poland with Lech Walesa. So that's how it was ended. And it was ended with as even Kaler admits, giant PR photo shoots of John Paul II doing PR photo shoots that were symbolically, opposed to the Soviets. I'm rambling about all this, but this is how we get into, and why is there this connection between the Vatican and the CIA? Well, guess what? Who was the CIA section chief in Rome for a long time? Oh, James Jesus Angleton. Who else was it there? Oh, William Colby.
Wow.
And it's really Colby in the 40s and probably Angleton as well. But definitely Colby is the one that first solidifies the relationship between Pius XII and the CIA and the sort of backdoor funding deals and operations. Originally, because they wanted to make sure that the Christian Democratic Party, which was, pro-West, pro-CIA, pro-Catholic Church, that they won the elections and the Communist Party in Italy didn't win. And so there was all kinds of black ops going on there with Aldo Moro and stage kidnapping and all this kind of stuff, which, again, was all Gladio adjacent and connected to Gladio for sure. But Gladio is another window into this because the funding was via the Vatican Bank. The Vatican would get money to help win the elections from the CIA, but then in turn they had to funnel money back to the black operations because the Vatican is the world's most secretive bank, you see, the Vatican Bank, I mean. So this is how it ties to Gladio, but this is where you get, even before Vatican II, a pretty intimate alliance of the CIA with the Vatican, particularly with William Colby, the famous Tradcat CIA operative.
The Roman Catholic connection here is one that really shouldn't be ignored, because you mentioned how even the Sicilian Mafia in one of your previous interviews, Jay, was essentially very deeply connected to some of these like Masonic Carbonari style rituals. For example, they had the death, the blood oath. It was very Masonic, and even in nature and structure. For example, you couldn't get to the top of a particular mob or mafia family. It was like layered defenses, almost like stages of Masonic initiation.
And I might add, just real quick, I don't mean to interrupt, but I have to brag about this. I want to remind people that if you're skeptical of this, like I've interviewed multiple times the most famous living gangster. So I've been on Sammy the Bull's podcast. He was the underboss to John Gotti, the last, kind of living family head. And had Sammy not been arrested by the FBI, he would have been the next mob boss. He would have been John Gotti, right? So in the first interview that we did, I brought up all this stuff to him. And he essentially confirmed everything we're talking about. In fact, he went into the Omerta and its kind of, esoteric Masonic type structure and symbolism. So this is all confirmed.
No, absolutely. And like even the formation of Vatican City itself, the sort of political rights it has, the so-called sovereignty that it has within the state of Italy. Like there's not many years between, say, Garibaldi's death and like the rise of Mussolini to power. And Italy is because it's so confusing, the state was so ruptured ever since the Renaissance period. Many people simply don't study Italian history and Roman Catholic history on that peninsula as to exactly what was taking place there after the Roman Empire. It just seems like the Italians simply arose out of thin air and Italian statehood. But it's deeply Masonic. It's tied to Napoleon, who, again, his brothers were all grand masters of various lodges. It's all very, shall we say, dark, esoteric.
Yes. And he aligned himself with the Sicilian Mafia, talking about Garibaldi here. So this is where you get the alliance between Mafia and conceivably they could have had an alliance even earlier because the mafiosi were the older. They were kind of like the local militia back in the, 14, 15, 1600s era. But, this is, again, mainline history. If you read just even a normie take like Selwyn Robb's History of the Five Families, like the first or second chapter goes into this kind of stuff. But and Sammy brings it up too. He says, we've been using this sort of cell structure, or it's actually a Roman legion type of structure that the Mafia has that's very tried and true. And he said, when I was in prison, we would have other gang members like black gangsters, Mexican gangsters, skinheads. They would ask us, hey, how do we structure the thing? Because you guys have been doing it for like a millennia. So anyway, so this is well known, this kind of secret, society cell type of structure or family structure that they use. And it's absolutely parallel to secret societies and can also be very parallel to the role of, say, a handler in intelligence operations too. So a lot of parallels, a lot of connections there, but I'm glad you mentioned Garibaldi because a lot of people don't know that there is a close connection between organized crime and Masonic secret societies, absolutely. And you can just see it in the oath itself. But it's odd because the Vatican is a curious player in this because of the fact that they were hamstrung at one point, according to Williams, because they were deeply in debt at the Vatican Bank. And at one point, the Rockefellers came in and bailed out the Vatican Bank for something like, I don't know, it was like $1 billion or $2 billion. This is, wow, if I recall, I'm over memory here. This is, I think, towards the end of the 70s when the Banco d'Ambrosio collapsed, which was running the Gladio stuff. That was kind of the main Italian bank aside from the Vatican Bank that was involved, because all these banks are basically intertwined and they're all wrapped up in one another. It's a bunch of like frauds within frauds within frauds within cutouts within cutouts. And this helps to obscure the transactions and make it kind of impossible to track. That's why they do it this way. Anyway, but long story short is just that if you go back to the P2 Lodge, which is the sort of fascist elements of Masonry, believe it or not, which supported Mussolini, the P2 lodges were still very powerful and had a lot of influence in Italy. And their headmaster was Licio Gelli, who, according to Williams, was sort of taking his orders from Kissinger. So basically, his theory is that Kissinger sort of directly ran Gladio in Italy, and by a very similar to Epstein-style compromise network they had through Bunga Bunga parties, which that doesn't begin with Berlusconi. That goes back to the Cold War. They had actually compromised a significant number of the Roman clergy, the cardinals and the Roman clergy in Italy.
Oh, wow.
And that's why they were going along with so many of the things that, basically the CIA wanted. So his thesis, Williams' thesis, is that basically Kissinger was just running the whole government in Italy throughout the Cold War through Licio Gelli, who was the headmaster to all the P2 circles and networks throughout, not just Italy, but by extension, it was actually all of Europe had these NATO stay-behind Gladio networks set up.
Thank you so much for listening to the free preview of this incredible Aether Hour with our good buddy Jay Dyer. Be sure to get behind the paywall to hear a much more expanded discussion, of course, on the tangential details about the JFK assassination. We circle back. We talk about the RFK assassination, as well as a bit of a tangent into serial killers, the reality of the intelligence connection with a lot of the 20th century serial killers, mass production of snuff films, as well as a deep dive into organized crime, its connection with the Vatican, and even some pontifications on what might be coming down the pike for the new papacy, as well as a whole host of other issues. So get behind the paywall, support the show, as well as get access to, at this point, hundreds and hundreds of hours of incredible discussions, uncensored, about history, orthodoxy, uncanonized saints, world Jewry, all these sorts of things. So thank you so much for listening. Get behind that paywall, and we will see you on the other side. God bless.